One very important way of understanding sin is that sin is rebelling against God's law. It's not doing what He requires of us, not living as He has called us to live, and therefore never fully being who God created us to be. Sin is living without reference to God, not viewing Him to be the defining reality of our lives around which our entire lives need to be centered. And when we don't live as if God is who He is, we violate His law and all the good, loving, protecting guidelines that He's provided to us for how to best and most fully live our lives. Think about it this way. If you were to walk off a cliff and say, I don't have to live by the law of gravity, I can live by my own rules. On the one hand, you aren't obeying a very specific rule and commandment, namely, don't walk off a cliff. But on the other hand, you're also not living in reference to gravity. You're living as if gravity were of no consequence or importance in your life. You would never say the laws of gravity are just so arbitrary, it just seems so unreasonable that I have to obey them. You would never say that because you understand that gravity is something that we must live in reference to. Of course, there would be guidelines to honor, boundaries to acknowledge. And do you know what happens when you walk off a cliff and try to break the law of gravity? Death and disintegration. When we don't live as if God is God, when we break God's loving law, when we fail to honor who He is, when we say or imply by our actions that He is of no consequence or importance in this or that part of our lives, we fail to fully be the people God created us to be, and it leads to death and disintegration. This illustration may help. The solar system exists harmoniously when all the planets orbit around the same center, namely the sun. If, however, the planets all decided on their own what to orbit around, or some of the planets chose not to orbit around anything or to orbit around themselves, what would happen? Death and disintegration. The solar system as we know it would unravel and fall apart because the planets are not orbiting around the correct center. They aren't living in reference to the sun, and therefore everything falls apart and is destroyed. Not living in reference to God not only leads to our death and disintegration, it's the reason why the entire cosmos is subject to death and disintegration. God created Adam and Eve to be the centerpiece and the pinnacle of creation. And yet when they sinned, not only did their disobedience of God's loving law have implications on their lives, it had implications on the entire cosmos. Paul writes that the wages of sin is death. Sin leads to death. And yet the gospel is that Jesus Christ experienced death so that we could live. In some ways, He was disintegrated on the cross, spiritually torn apart, so that we could be made whole. He died for our sin so that we could be made alive. He experienced death and disintegration. He paid the penalty for our sin so that we would not have to.